Hello everyone, my name is Jasmin and I have interesting conversations with interesting people every Sunday, usually in German. Today is an exception because we have a very special guest here from the United States, Chicago to be exact, actually in from London right now. He has been recognized as one of the most famous political science professors in history. I call him the rock star of geopolitics, Professor John Mearsheimer. Welcome to Berlin.
Glad to be here, Jasmin.
Thank you so much for meeting me here. So what will we be discussing today? We will be asking a central question in this interview, and that is, can we avoid World War III? It's a question that I quite frankly like to avoid as to not manifest an outcome that would be detrimental to the world. And now, a few days ahead of the US election, it is definitely a question on the mind of very many Europeans who are, in my opinion, at the whims of US foreign policy. So who or which presidential candidate stands for a more peaceful world, or does it even matter when we look at the tragedy of great power politics? So we're just a few days away from the presidential elections in the United States. I know what you call them. You like to refer to them as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. So maybe you can still give us a prediction. Which one is it going to be?
Well, I think that at this point in time, it's almost impossible to predict with any certainty who's going to win the election because all the polls are remarkably close. If I was forced to bet my life, I was told I had to bet, I would bet that Trump will win. He'll win the electoral vote, and I would bet that Harris wins the popular vote, and that it turns out like the 2016 election. But that's just a guess on my part.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to share who you're voting for?
No. But I will say that I'm not voting for Trump, and I'm not voting for Harris.
Oh, wow. But is there an independent candidate still running?
There are a number of candidates, and you can also in the United States write in candidates. In other words, I could write in your name.
Well, but that wouldn't make it. I'm not a U.S. citizen, so that wouldn't make.
Yeah, well, I think voting for a third party is not going to make any difference. I mean, a number of my friends would say that who are profoundly anti-Trump, that if you don't vote for Harris, you'll end up with Trump. So in effect, voting for a third person or a third party is like voting for Trump.
Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't want to do that?
No, I won't vote for the Democrats because of the genocide in Gaza. Mm-hmm. I think that the Biden administration is complicit in the genocide, and genocide's a red line for me. And I would never vote for Biden or for Kamala Harris because, again, they're complicit in the genocide.
So you've already touched on this very sensitive subject that we were going to get to, Israel-Gaza, and we are in Germany, so this is also a very interesting topic to discuss in this country because you know the history. I mean, I don't need to lecture you on that, but maybe on the question of the president. So let me ask you this: which president do you think would be less aggressive on the foreign policy front?
I think it's quite clear that Trump would be less aggressive. I think Trump is not a warmonger. I think that Kamala Harris, like Joe Biden, they're basically warmongers. They've never seen a war that they didn't want to fight. I think in contrast, Trump is not interested in fighting wars. And I think where you see this most clearly manifested is in Europe. I mean, what Trump wants to do is shut down the war in Ukraine. He wants to have good relations with Putin and, more generally, good relations with the Russians. If Harris is elected, she'll basically continue Biden's policy, which is to play hardball with the Russians forever, do everything to topple Putin, and to keep the Ukraine war going forever. So I think that you see the distinction between the two candidates most clearly when you think about how they approach Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. You have also said in the past that the foreign establishment, which is also referred to as the blob, is pretty independent of which president is actually in power. So how is it possible that Trump can have his own idea of foreign policy concerning Ukraine, but maybe not in other foreign policy arenas?
Well, Trump can have his own foreign policy views or his preferences on any particular issue. And the question is, what will happen if he has a different perspective than the blob has? It will then be sort of Trump versus the blob. And my argument is, in those cases, the blob will win. Now, if you go back to Trump's first term, which was from 2017 to 2021, he had a number of fights with the blob. And in fact, one fight involved relations with Russia and relations with Putin, because even back then, Trump was interested in having good relations with Putin and with Russia more generally. But he failed. The blob beat him back. And he and his principal advisors are well aware that in his first time, the blob beat him. And their belief is that this time they're going to bring in seasoned veterans from the first administration, and they've learned a lot from that past experience. So this time Trump is going to beat the blob. And the one area where you're going to see that play out is Ukraine. When you think about Trump on foreign policy, there are three big issues that the United States cares about on the foreign policy front. One is China, containing China in East Asia. Number two, supporting Israel in the Middle East. And on those two issues, there's not much daylight between the blob on one hand and Trump on the other. So I don't see any big fights in either of those arenas. The place where there's likely to be a fight is over Ukraine and over relations with the Russians, because there the blob is much more in line with what Biden and Harris want to do and not with what Trump wants to do. So the $64,000 question, as we used to say when I was a kid, moving forward is who will win, Trump or the blob on the Ukraine-Russia issue.
You've also said that the U.S. is not interested in a diplomatic solution in the Ukraine war. And I figure when you speak about the U.S. in this quote that you're talking about the blob. But maybe you can explain to us why you think that the U.S. is not interested in diplomacy or negotiation in Ukraine, when you've mentioned that we have, like, the U.S. has three fronts that they're fighting, sort of, not all in military conflict. China, Israel, and Ukraine. Looking at those three, Ukraine is the least important. So why wouldn't they be interested in negotiating a peace deal after now over 2.5 years?
Well, the United States is run by people. This is certainly true with regard to the Biden administration. It would be true with regard to a Harris administration, and it's true of the blob. These people and this institution all believe that the United States is incredibly powerful and that it can use a big stick to get its way here, there, and everywhere. There's little sense in the United States that you have to prioritize. When I look at these three theaters where the United States is involved, it's clear to me that East Asia is the most important area of the world because China is the greatest threat to the United States. It is a peer competitor. And this is why we're talking about pivoting to Asia, right? But when you talk about pivoting to Asia and therefore maybe pivoting away from Europe, the blob and the Biden administration don't want to hear that. They think we can be in Europe in full force, we can be in the Gulf or the Middle East in full force, and we can still pivot to East Asia. So number one, we have no sense that we have to prioritize. And number two, we have a deep-seated faith in big stick diplomacy. We have a deep-seated faith that military force can solve all sorts of problems. And therefore, when you talk about diplomacy with Vladimir Putin, people say this is unthinkable. He's the second coming of Adolf Hitler. Nobody would negotiate with Adolf Hitler. Therefore, we're not going to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. But moreover, we don't have to because we have this big stick and we have the capability to deal with the Ukraine scenario as well as the other scenarios we face.
But that isn't very realistic if we're looking at what's happening. And then again, I would argue that the U.S. isn't in full force in all of those three theaters, right?
I agree with you. I mean, we have to prioritize. There's no question about that.
Yeah. Okay, it's one question to prioritize in which arena you're going to really, where you're going to try to use your power, right?
Yeah, concentrate your resources.
Concentrate resources, thank you. However, they're not in Ukraine with full power. So, I mean, you could be like, okay, we're going to do a little bit in Ukraine and we're still going to concentrate on Southeast Asia. That's also a possible scenario.
Well, one thing you want to remember is that the United States, and this is true of the Europeans as well, foolishly, ran down their industrial bases during the unipolar moment, after the Cold War, so that the Europeans and the Americans don't have the industrial capacity to build huge numbers of artillery tubes and artillery shells. So when you look at the war between Ukraine and Russia, one of the principal reasons that the Ukrainians are losing that war and are going to lose it is because they have not had, and now do not have, and will not have enough artillery. The Ukrainians, of course, don't have the capability to build much artillery. They were counting on us in the West to give them the artillery, but we do not have the ability to produce that artillery.
The entire West doesn't have the ability to provide enough artillery to the Ukrainians. That seems odd.
It may seem odd, but it's a fact of life. And the fact is that now that we're providing all sorts of weaponry to the Israelis, that means we have less weaponry to give to the Ukrainians. And by the way, we are shortchanging the Taiwanese. The United States is committed to containing China, and part of that containment strategy is working with Taiwan to buttress Taiwan's defenses. But because so much of the military weaponry that we produce is going to Israel and going to Ukraine, we are shortchanging what we're doing in Taiwan. And this gets back to the earlier discussion we were having about prioritizing. This is why I agreed with you that it's imperative for the United States to prioritize. And if that's true, what we should do is we should try to use diplomacy to shut down the Ukraine war. And we should put huge pressure on the Israelis to end their wars in the Middle East so we can pivot to the most important area of the world, which is East Asia. But we're doing exactly the opposite.
Mm-hmm. And you're also never a consultant to the blob, as I understand, but people in other parts of the world do like to speak with you. So you met with the Indonesian president. You were invited to the, what was it called? The Middle East Council on Foreign Affairs in Doha. You were just now in London. So you're quite popular as a political science professor all around the world, but not in the United States.
Well, I would say, generally speaking, not in the West. I mean, there's no question I was just in Britain, and I was at Oxford and I was at Cambridge giving talks, and I was interacting with students. But it's unthinkable that anyone in the British government would ever talk to me any more than anybody in the German government or the American government would talk to me. We have a very particular ideology in the West about how to think about the rest of the world. And anybody within the West who's out of sync with that ideology is persona non grata. So you have this situation where people like me, Jeffrey Sachs is another example, who are prominent academics. When we go outside of the West, we're treated like heroes. People are interested in talking to us. They're interested in our views. And it's in large part because many of our views are consistent with the way people outside of the West think about the world. But inside the West, where we challenge conventional wisdoms, right, we're not allowed to appear in the mainstream media. We're not consulted by governments because they believe they have the truth, and anybody who disagrees with them is a fool. For example, with regard to Ukraine, I've had views on Ukraine that have been out of sync with the mainstream going back to 1993, when I was probably the only person in the West, and I mean the only person, who said Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons because someday Russia may come knocking. But the fact that I was out of sync then and have been out of sync since then with Blob on the subject of Ukraine policy, I get dismissed. It's not like they bring me in and say, John, you're a smart man. You've been right on a lot of issues before. Even though we disagree with you, we want to hear what you have to say so we can see, if there are any holes in our argument, if there are any merits in your argument. But that's not the way it happens in the West. And by the way, this is why the West is in so much trouble.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you do enjoy a good debate, and you do get invited at least on television shows like Piers Morgan. to discuss Israel, Gaza, Ukraine. And so I do think that your views are represented in the Western media, at least, I would say.
Absolutely. But let me make a distinction here. I distinguish between what I call the mainstream media and alternative media, right? And I think where people like me and people like Jeff Sachs are X'd out is in the mainstream media.
But Piers Morgan is mainstream, I would say.
Not really. And he's close.
Yeah.
But not really. He's kind of a renegade. And I think what's happened is people have lost so much faith in the mainstream media in countries like Germany, Britain, the United States, and the West more generally, that they've turned to alternative media. And there are just all sorts of platforms out there. I would put you in that category.
Of course, yeah.
Right. You're alternative media. Here you are talking to me. You'll put the video out of our talk. Lots of people will watch it. And this is happening time after time with all sorts of people like me, Jeff Sachs, and many others. And the end result is that lots of people in the body populace, right, turn to these alternative media sources because when they listen to us talk, not all of them, but a lot of people think that we make sense. Maybe not on every issue, but a lot of the issues. And I have a very profound sense that people, the average person in Publix in Germany, Britain, France, the United States, you name it, are hungry for alternative voices. They have a sense that something is wrong. And you see this in voting patterns in the West and what's happening in the political system. This is why Donald Trump is so popular. 15, 25 years ago, Donald Trump wouldn't have been a serious candidate to be president of the United States. I remember saying to myself in 2016, when the two serious candidates were Donald Trump and it looked like Bernie Sanders was going to beat Hillary Clinton, I said to myself, something is really going on here, that Bernie Sanders, who is a self-declared socialist, could become a serious presidential candidate in the United States, and that Donald Trump, right, who is, not a serious politician, this is what I was saying in 2016, could be the Republican presidential candidate. What's going on here? And what's going on is people are profoundly dissatisfied with the establishment. They're profoundly dissatisfied with the mainstream media, with the foreign policy elites. They look at what we do in foreign policy, we meaning the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, and what they see is one disaster after another. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine is going to be a disaster. Look at what's happening in Gaza. The United States is complicit in a genocide. So people want to know what's going on, and they look to alternative media, and in terms of who they vote for, they end up voting for someone like Donald Trump. Many people, for understandable reasons, scratch their head and say, how could anybody vote for Donald Trump? But I just provided what I think is the main reason.
Because they don't want to vote for Kamala. And they don't want to vote for what we have currently because there is such a great distrust in institutions, in the media, and the establishment, as you have just laid out.
Yeah. If I can just make one other point, Jasmin. If you go back to 2016, Trump started out in the Republican primaries. He was one of a number of candidates. Virtually all of his opponents in the Republican primaries in 2016 were mainstream establishment figures, blue blood Republicans. And what Trump did was run the table. He knocked them all off. And in 2020, and now again in 2024, none of those establishment figures would dare to challenge Trump. And I think that really tells you something about where the body politics are. In this case, we're talking about the United States, but it's not only the United States. You see it in Germany. The established parties in Germany are in real trouble. And, parties on the right and parties on the left are surging. And you want to ask yourself, why is this the case? And it's because the established parties and the blob, call it what you want, are doing a very poor job of managing policy, and the media basically cheerleads the blob if we're talking about foreign policy, and people don't want to hear that anymore. They'd rather hear, people like me talk about what's wrong and why we're in, a mess in Ukraine and why things are going to hell in a handbasket in the Middle East.
Do you follow German politics?
Just a bit.
Just a bit. So now that you travel a lot, you speak with a lot of different people from different areas of the world who like to listen to you talk about the way you see things. What role do you think Germany plays in international politics currently?
Well, Germany has always been a truly important player in Europe. And here we're talking about post-1945. There's no question that it was truly important before 1945. I mean, World War I and World War II were all about Germany. And in a very important way, the Cold War was all about Germany, right? It was the Germans, right? It was the Germans who were divided. You had East Germany and West Germany. The Soviets were on top of East Germany. We were on top of West Germany. And everybody understood in the Cold War that Germany was a truly important player, even though it was in two parts at the time. Then the Cold War ends, and I think Germany comes together. You have the unification, and it is, during the unipolar moment, the most powerful state in Europe, and it still is. So it matters greatly. Germans, as I don't have to tell you, are very reluctant to behave too independently, given their history in Europe. And furthermore, given the role that the United States has played as a pacifier in Europe, providing security for Germany and other countries in Europe, the Germans have been rather circumspect in terms of asserting themselves on foreign policy. And I believe that the German leaders were much more assertive during the Cold War and the early days of unipolarity than they are today. It's quite remarkable to me how subservient the Germans have become, and the Europeans more generally. And I can tell you why I think that's the case. But before I do, I want to point out what I think is the most important example. In April 2008, at the Bucharest NATO summit, which is where the decision to expand NATO into Georgia and into Ukraine was made. A catastrophic decision. We're going to look back on that over the years as one of the biggest foreign policy mistakes the West has ever made. But at that meeting in April 2008, both Nicolas Sarkozy, who was the French prime minister, or the French president at the time, and Angela Merkel, both of them adamantly opposed moving to bring Ukraine into NATO. And Angela Merkel very smartly said afterwards that the reason she opposed bringing Ukraine into NATO was she understood that Putin would view it as a declaration of war. You want to think about that statement. Merkel is saying that she understood that Putin would view it as a declaration of war. Well, you know what's happened. She was right. But what did Merkel do? She caved to Bush. George W. Bush was in his last year as president. He was pushing very hard to bring Ukraine into NATO. And instead of fighting him tooth and nail, which is exactly what she should have done, she should have stood up to him. She caved, as did Sarkozy. And now we have this disaster on our hands.
But she did act differently towards Russia in her terms, multiple terms, the pipelines and everything. She had definitely different relations. She supported the Minsk deals.
Of course. No, I don't believe she supported the Minsk deals. I mean, in fact, I think after the 2008 decision, her behavior towards Russia was remarkably foolish.
Even though she supported the pipelines, she supported economic dependence, which is things that people blame her for now that we were so dependent on Russian energy supplies.
No, I think economically, everything you say is true. No disagreement. We're talking about the politics here, the international politics of it. First, we were talking about what happened April 2008. Okay. Then the crisis over Ukraine breaks out February 2014. And you remember part of that crisis is that you effectively have a civil war in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass. And the Minsk Accords are designed to shut down that civil war. And there are four actors who are trying to make an effort to shut it down. So we were led to believe. The Germans, and this is Merkel, of course, the French, the Russians, of course, and the Ukrainians. And Merkel, Francois Hollande, and Poroshenko, Peter Poroshenko, who was the Ukrainian leader at the time, all three of them have admitted, it's in the public record now, that they had no interest in making the Minsk agreement work, and all they were doing was buying time. They were leading Putin on. They were buying time so that the Ukrainian army could be rearmed and trained. Putin, on the other hand, was clearly interested in settling the conflict in the Donbass. He wanted to make the Minsk Accords work. He has subsequently said that he feels completely betrayed by the West. He believes this is not the only case where he has been betrayed by the West, or Russia has been betrayed by the West. And one of the reasons it's going to be extremely difficult to get a diplomatic deal to shut down the Ukraine war is that Putin doesn't trust the West. And when you hear Donald Trump saying that he's going to shut it down before he moves into the White House or immediately after he moves into the White House, Trump is operating on the assumption that Putin is going to trust him. I can guarantee you Putin is not going to trust Trump any more than he would trust Kamala Harris or Joe Biden.
Are you sure about that? Because
Yes.
Trump is a different figure in this whole theater of foreign policy. He is an anti-establishment figure, as we just discussed before, and he doesn't have the same blob around him.
No.
So you wouldn't agree with that?
No, but remember what we said. Between 2017 and 2021, Trump went head-to-head with the blob on the Russia-Ukraine issue, and Trump lost.
Yeah, but he went head-to-head, and I think that's a different position than the other presidential candidates or the other people would
But
have.
he lost.
Okay.
So you're assuming that when he gets if he gets reelected.
I assume he does get
Yeah,
elected.
let's assume he gets
Yeah.
elected, right? That this time he could beat the blob back. And I do not believe he can do that. And the reason is, I think that Putin is going to drive such a hard deal. Let me just say a quick word on that, because this is very important. Putin has said, just to have negotiations to end the war, the West and Ukraine have to accept two facts of life. One is that those 4 oblasts that we have now annexed, plus Crimea, are Russia's forever. The West has to accept that. And number two, the West and Ukraine have to say categorically that Ukraine will never be in NATO and it will be a neutral state. This is just to have negotiations.
And this is unacceptable for the West.
Yes, it's clearly unacceptable for the West, but given our conversation, the question is it acceptable for Trump? When Trump had his famous debate with Joe Biden that finished Joe Biden off, right? Trump was explicitly asked the question whether he would accept those two terms. He said no. Well, if he doesn't accept those two terms, you can't even get negotiations started. Right? And if he does say he accepts those two terms, neutral NATO plus recognition forever of Russian absorption of those 4 oblasts, the blob will go after him hammer and tongue. And then we'll see what happens. And if I had to bet on who wins when it's the blob against Trump, my money's on the blob.
Mm-hmm, because it's been winning, let's say, the past decade.
It's very big. It's very powerful,
Yeah.
deep-seated ideology, and as you say, it's been on a winning streak for a long time. The other thing is that Trump is not a careful and calculating politician. He's not a real Machiavelli, and that's why he's ultimately not that dangerous. Again, I'm not a Trump supporter, as I made clear. I'm not voting for him, but he's not a sophisticated president. He's not somebody like Lyndon Johnson, who was really dangerous because he knew how to make the machinery work. Trump he's careless, right? He's not somebody, who I think could go up against the blob and beat the blob. But we'll see. I may be wrong.
This is interesting, the way you laid out Ukraine and how it could play out, because I do have the idea that a lot of Europeans, or Germans in particular, look at the elections in the United States and are kind of hoping for Trump because they believe that he would shut down Ukraine, and because he has shown that he's more of a peace president than Biden and the establishment around Biden, right? So what would you say, is this fear of a certain World War III that some Germans are very afraid of? Because, there were discussions about a general draft in Germany, bringing it back, and people get a little antsy. So what is going on here? Then we have our defense minister talking about becoming kriegstüchtig, which means to be more war ready, right? And this is something that Germans are very sensitive to. So what would you say to Germans, or maybe Europeans more in general, who are afraid that things could escalate to a World War III when we're looking at these three areas in the world, right? Southeast Asia, Israel, and Ukraine, which is the closest to Germany?
Well, let me say, just at a very general level, that I think that it's unlikely that we'll have anything approximating World War III. But it's not impossible. And one can hypothesize all sorts of plausible scenarios where you get a major war between, let's say, NATO and Russia, or China and the United States. But let me just unpack what's going on in Europe and tell you how I see things. First of all, I think the most likely scenario by far where the Russians use nuclear weapons is where they're losing. And in 2022, when the Ukrainians were doing very well and the Russians were surrendering territory in Ukraine, I think that was a very dangerous time. Because if the Russians were to lose in Ukraine, I believe they would use nuclear weapons.
And let me just add, at this point, we talked about this in the interview that we did 2.5 years ago, and I'm going to link it somewhere up here, but continue.
Okay, yeah. But that was the scenario to worry about, because the Russians view what's going on in Ukraine as an existential threat. Many people in the West refuse to accept the argument that the Russians view this as an existential threat, or NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat. But you want to understand, the Russians think it's an existential threat, and it's what they think that matters. So they think it's an existential threat. If they're losing in Ukraine, that's when we really have to be worried about nuclear use and the possibility of escalation up the nuclear ladder. But that's not happening. Russia's going to win the war. Okay. And in fact, I don't think Trump or Harris will be the principal driving force behind ending this war. It will be events on the battlefield.
Oh, can you quickly, just a quick question in between. What does it mean when you say Russia's going to win the war? What's that going to look like?
They're going to end up conquering a large slice of territory in eastern Ukraine.
And is Ukraine just going to, what's it called, capitulate? Like, are they just going to wave the white flag and say, we're done now?
Yeah, I think that's going to happen at some point in a not too distant future. To put it in slightly different terms, so I'm perfectly clear, I think the fighting or the shooting is going to stop, okay? But what's going to happen, in my opinion, is you're going to get a frozen conflict. This is a very important point to understand. I do not think you're going to get a negotiated settlement. You're not going to get a peace agreement. Right? Because the Ukrainians in the West will never accept Russian annexation of territory inside of eastern Ukraine, and they will continue to flirt with the idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO. And that means you can't work out a deal. Remember the conditions that Putin has stipulated for getting a peace agreement, right? We're not going to accept those conditions. You're not going to get a peace agreement. You're going to get a frozen conflict. And you want to understand, once that frozen conflict sets in, the West, mainly the United States, but the West, and this will include the Germans, and Ukraine will go to great lengths to undermine Russia's position in Ukraine and to undermine Russia itself. The Russians, for their part, are going to go to great lengths to cause trouble in Europe for as far as the eye can see, and the Russians are going to go to great lengths to poison transatlantic relations. So you're going to have this nasty competition between Russia on one side, Ukraine and the West on the other side.
But not necessarily on the battlefield. You're talking about like disinformation, propaganda efforts, and so on.
Yeah, it'll be a frozen conflict. But what you want to remember is that there are a number of potential flashpoints where that frozen conflict can turn into a hot conflict. And I'll give them to you quickly, and we can talk about any one of them in more detail if you want. The Arctic, the Baltic Sea, Kaliningrad, Belarus. When Lukashenko steps down, you can rest assured the United States will try to foster a color revolution in Belarus. You think that's going to go over well with the Russians? I would not bet a lot of money on that. Belarus, Moldova, and the Black Sea.
Do you really think that the foreign policy establishment is planning to do something like that after the shit show in Ukraine?
It's in America's DNA at this point, right? We think, and you Europeans have basically drunk the Kool-Aid and bought onto this whole enterprise. You think we have a right, a responsibility, and the power to run around the world, overthrowing governments and promoting democracy. I'm not saying you do, but most Europeans do. Most elites do.
Well, the elite does. The people,
right.
Not so much. But okay.
The German blob.
The German blob, yeah. Or part of the German blob, at least. Because things are changing. And I think with a new generation of politicians, you could see a change because we've seen it in the past. So something like that could happen again.
Let's hope.
But what you were talking about before was that you do not think there was a real scenario of World War III happening, which is actually kind of nice to hear from you.
Yeah, so. I think it's highly unlikely that will happen in Europe. I think I want to be very clear here. I think you're going to have poisonous relations, right, between Russia on one side and Ukraine.
For the next couple of decades, right?
For the next couple of decades.
So like another Cold War.
Yeah.
Without a wall.
Yeah, I find it hard to imagine. I hope that I'm wrong, that things can be improved. And I want to emphasize again, there are all these potential flashpoints. You want to remember the ice is melting in the Arctic, and that has all sorts of geopolitical consequences. And now that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, 7 of the 8 countries that are physically located in the Arctic are NATO countries. And of course, the odd country out is Russia. The Russians, who wanted to keep the Chinese out of the Arctic, have now brought the Chinese with them into the Arctic. The Chinese are piggybacking on the Russians in the Arctic. Why is this the case? It is the case because the Russians are outnumbered 7-1.
They were forced, but by their own action, because they attacked Ukraine, right?
There's no question. Yeah. There's no question about that. There's no question about that. But I just want to be clear here. I believe, as I said before, the decision in April 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO was a catastrophic decision, right? It was remarkably foolish. I believe Angela Merkel understood this. Again, that's my point. To think that she understood that Putin would see this as a declaration of war, which of course is what caused him to invade Ukraine. It was the principal reason. I understand that most people in the West, especially in a country like Germany, don't accept that argument. But the evidence, in my humble opinion, is overwhelming that that's why he invaded Ukraine. But once he invaded Ukraine, putting this to an end, ending this conflict and going back to having some sort of peaceful arrangement in Europe is almost impossible. It was an unbelievably foolish move. And again, the United States bears principal responsibility. It was George W. Bush and Condi Rice who were in the driver's seat.
Okay, well, it's good to hear, and I think a lot of people are going to be relieved that you do not see a possible World War III scenario, even though you do see these flashpoints where conflict can ignite because there's so much tension between the West and Russia. However, your friend Jeffrey Sachs, who you already spoke about, has been quite adamant about the potential of a possible nuclear war. So he's of the opinion that that's a possibility. He says we need to worry about it, but what's your opinion on that?
I think a nuclear war is highly unlikely, if not extremely unlikely.
In every theater, every arena?
No, in Europe.
In Europe, okay.
No, in Europe, which is what we've talked about up to now. I think the potential for war is there. You know, as I said, once you get a frozen conflict, you have all those potential flashpoints, right? Or all those flashpoints where you could get a war. I think East Asia is the more dangerous area in this regard.
For nuclear war.
For nuclear war, yeah. And, but before I tell you why, I just want to make a very quick point about nuclear weapons and World War III. I think that nuclear weapons, because they're weapons of mass destruction, are effectively weapons of peace. The mere presence of nuclear weapons makes everybody incredibly reluctant to go to war if both sides have nuclear weapons. And that's due in part to the fact that we have hardly any understanding of nuclear escalation. First of all, we don't have good theories on escalation in general. I know the international relations literature very well. No good theories on escalation. And thank God we've never had a nuclear war, so we don't know much about nuclear escalation. We just don't know anything. Given the consequences of nuclear escalation, given the consequences of nuclear use, much less nuclear escalation, right, the last thing you want to do is have a nuclear war, right? So there is a powerful incentive to avoid a war between two nuclear-armed countries. So in a very important way, it's a force for peace, nuclear weapons. But to get at what you're talking about, people in Europe, and of course people all over the world, live in fear of World War III because they believe it would be a nuclear war, which it probably would be. And the fact is that if you got into a major conflagration involving, let's say, the United States and China, or Russia and the United States, given that we don't know anything about we don't know much about escalation, we could all end up getting incinerated. There's no question about that. And it's the fact that we could all get incinerated, which is what makes nuclear weapons a force for peace. But nobody can guarantee that those nuclear weapons won't be used, and therefore there's a real dark side as well as a bright side to the presence of nuclear weapons in international politics. And it's always important to keep that in mind. Now, I was saying to you that I thought the most dangerous area is East Asia. And the best way to highlight that is to compare East Asia today with Europe in the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were eyeball to eyeball on what we called the inter-German border, right? It was the central front. It was the center of Europe, which was the principal focal point between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet threat was seen as being mainly located in Europe. What you had in Europe were two massive armies, NATO armies, Warsaw Pact armies, armed to the teeth each with thousands of nuclear weapons, thousands of tactical aircraft. So when we ran war games during the Cold War, it was almost impossible to get a war started. This isn't a war game, because everybody understood that when these two massive armies armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons crashed into each other, you would probably end up vaporizing everybody. So hard to get a war started. Fast forward to the present, to East Asia. There's no central front. Where are the flashpoints? South China Sea, Taiwan, and the East China Sea. Let's just talk about the South China Sea. It's very easy to imagine a war breaking out between the United States and China in the South China Sea. It's not the central front, right? This is not to say, I want to be very clear, I'm not saying a war is likely to break out in the South China Sea, but it's much easier to imagine a war breaking out between the United States and China in the South China Sea, or over Taiwan, or in the East China Sea over those rocks that are disputed territory between China on one hand and Japan on the other. You can imagine a war breaking out quite easily. Again, that's not to say it's going to happen. Furthermore, when you start thinking about nuclear use, using nuclear weapons in the South China Sea, even using nuclear weapons in the context of defending Taiwan, is fundamentally different than using nuclear weapons on the Central Front during the Cold War. So what I'm saying to you is that if you think about the geography and the nature of the conflict in East Asia today and compare it to what we had in the Cold War, you see it's more dangerous. Then what you want to remember is that China is a potential regional hegemon. It is a peer competitor to the United States. And the United States cares about China much more than it cares about Russia. Russia is not a very powerful country. The reason that Germans are not spending lots of money on defense, and the reason that Germany is not mobilizing its population to contain Vladimir Putin, is because everybody knows deep down inside Russia's not a great threat, right? Despite all the hype you hear in Germany and in the West more generally, it's not a great threat. China is in a completely different category. From our point of view, China doesn't matter to you. You're a European. Given geography, China is no threat. If you're an American, China matters. It is what the Pentagon calls the pacing threat. It's the pacing threat. It's the one we really care about. It's why we should be pivoting to Asia. All of this is to say the potential for an intense security competition between the United States and China is not to be underestimated. And when you marry that to the fact that Taiwan is probably the central point of contention between the United States and China, and the Chinese to a person consider Taiwan sacred territory that we're keeping out of their hands, the potential for trouble is really great. And then marry that argument with what I said about using nuclear weapons or fighting wars out in the middle of the ocean versus fighting wars on the Central Front. So all of this is to say, if there is a place where there is potential for World War III with nuclear weapons, it's in East Asia. It's not in Europe.
Mm-hmm. So in the beginning of the year, you said that it's a quote, there's a non-trivial chance that the U.S. will fight China in the years ahead. So this is what you've just laid out to us. The Chinese, you often get invited to China. You were just in Beijing a couple of weeks ago debating, I forget his name, but you've debated him in the past.
Shui Tongyan.
And you say that the Chinese are your people, right? They're realists at heart, and they debate you firmly because they don't believe that China is a real threat. They don't want to see China as a peer competitor or threat, or no, more so a threat to the United States, right? They say we can rise peacefully. You are complete disagreement to this argument, obviously. You say that China needs to be contained and it cannot rise peacefully, right? I'm just summarizing. However, there's this whole other area that we haven't even discussed yet, with China probably becoming a regional hegemon, and the
not if we can help it.
Exactly. The United States obviously doesn't want that. But, we have this whole, this whole group called the BRICS Plus, right, states. There was just a summit in Kazan in Russia. China obviously is the most economically powerful state in that group. And there was a big stir in Germany, I would say. There's a lot of media reports about it, a lot more than there used to be. And the UN General Secretary Guterres was also there, which kind of gives you a feel that you can't really ignore this group anymore, right? And you've also said that 2017, we started moving into this multipolar moment. Maybe before I continue the question, I wanted to ask, what exactly happened in 2017 that made us move into the multipolar moment?
Well, whether you're in a unipolar moment, which means you have one great power, or in a multipolar system where you have three great powers, the United States, China, and Russia, is all a function of how powerful those countries are. And what had happened over the course of the 1990s and the 2000s, up to about 2017, is that China had grown economically by leaps and bounds, and it turned that economic might into military might and became a great power. And what happened in the Russian case is that Putin becomes president in 2000. You remember Yeltsin had been president in the 1990s. Russia was a basket case in the 90s. And slowly but steadily, Putin brings Russia back from the dead. And the end result is by about 2017, the Russian economy has improved to the point where it can generate reasonably significant military capabilities. And the Russians have, I think, enough economic and military wherewithal by 2017 to also be considered a great power. But I want to make it clear, the United States remains the most powerful state on the planet. The peer competitor, the number two, is China. And the great fear of the United States is that number two will become number one. Russia is number three, and there's a big power gap between 2 and 3. And this is why I said to you before, Russia is no threat to dominate Europe. I mean,
the Russians don't like hearing that, right? You know that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
They take offense. They take it personal. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
But okay, so it's interesting. So you say we moved into this multipolar moment 2017 with China and Russia being competitors. And I actually read an old article that you published, 1990, which was also quite, which caused quite a stir. It was titled, "We Will Soon Miss the Cold War." And there's some interesting stuff in there. You wrote, this is a quote, that the multipolar system or multipolar systems are the more dangerous geometry of power, which I thought was interesting because we are in a multipolar moment right now. But then you continued and you wrote, bipolar and multipolar systems both are likely to be more peaceful when power is distributed equally in them. So maybe considering the BRICS multipolarity and the arguments that you've laid out and this fear of nuclear war that could ignite, could you maybe explain to me, is multipolarity dangerous or not?
Well, if China were as weak as Russia, okay, and Russia and China both were incapable of dominating their regions of the world, becoming a regional hegemon, the United States would have less reason to pick a fight and try to contain either one of those countries. The problem that you face in a multipolar system is if you have a country like China that threatens to dominate Asia, East Asia, and the Americans therefore are going to contest that. And if, let's assume the Russians were really powerful and they threatened to dominate Europe, then the United States would move in seriously to Europe. Europe would look very different today than it does. It would look more like the Cold War because we would see Russia as a potential hegemon. Just to give you another example, if you're the United States, it's 1940. You're looking at East Asia, Japan, potential hegemon. You're looking at Europe, Nazi Germany, potential hegemon. It's no accident that the United States fights a two-front war, right? We fought in Europe and we fought in the Pacific. We decisively defeated Germany, along with the Soviets, who played the key role. I don't want to lose sight of that fact. But the United States played a key role in defeating Nazi Germany, and we played the dominant role for sure in defeating Imperial Japan. We did not want Imperial Japan to dominate East Asia, and we did not want Germany to dominate Europe. And by the way, the reason we get into World War I in 1917 is it's looking like Germany is going to win World War I, and we come in to prevent that from happening. So you see, in that multipolar world, and it is a multipolar world before 1945, the United States, right, sees these two potential hegemons, and this is what World War II is all about.
It's limited evidence, I would say, right? Because we only have one scenario in the past that you can actually refer to, right?
I think that probably is the case. I'd have to search the catacombs of my mind, but at the moment I can't.
I mean, we can all follow the argument, obviously. I just think it's interesting because a lot of people look at the BRICS group and they see this alternative system, right? That they're going to build parallel institutions, that they're going to be a little bit more independent of the West, because as we have discussed, people are quite distrusting of Western institutions, not only outside of the West, but also in the West, right?
No question.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you say that this multipolarity can be dangerous. Let me ask you this. So I obviously understand that you see China as a competitor because it has the potential of becoming a regional hegemon, which is why you say nuclear war is, if it were likely, more likely in that arena and not in Europe. I understand that. Do you see, is there a possibility of something like bipolarity happening again when we're looking at the West and the global majority or the BRIC state that we're looking at, maybe with China, Russia, and India at the forefront? Is there like a new version of a sort of Cold War that could happen? You know, because there's not just a difference in how they want to de-dollarize and stuff like that, but it's also, they have different values, the way they look at international politics and stuff. It's just, it kind of seems to me that there could be like a Cold War, a new version of that could be appearing in the future.
Yeah, let me make one clarifying point and then tend to agree with you. For me, polarity is a function of the number of great powers in the system, right? And BRICS is not a great power. It's just like Europe. People talk about Europe like Europe is a political entity. It's not. There's no such thing as the state of Europe, United States.
They wanted to make that happen, but it's not happening.
Yeah, it didn't happen, right. Yeah. So you have multipolarity, okay. But what's happened here, and this is sort of consistent with where you were going in your conversation, or your comments on BRICS, is that the United States and the West more generally have driven the Russians and the Chinese together. They're like this. And of course, they're both in BRICS. The Indians, who don't want to get too close to the Americans or the West, have gotten very sympathetic to the Chinese and have a long history of good relations with Russia. So the Indians don't want to get too close to the Americans and the West, and therefore they are bonding with the Russians and the Chinese. And then you throw in countries like Iran, South Africa, we could go on and on. There are all sorts of countries in the system that either loathe or distrust the West. And because the West, especially the United States, is so powerful, and it's using economic sanctions against this country, that country, and every other country, right? These BRICS countries are coming together and forming a quite potent institution, which is aimed at the West. And this is what I think you're getting at when you talk about bipolarity. See, it's not bipolarity in the sense that you just have two great powers. Mm-hmm. It's bipolar in the intuitive sense that it's the West versus the rest.
Exactly.
Right?
The global majority.
Yeah, global majority. And as I was saying to you before, if you think of my discussion of what my experience is, talking to people in the West, talking to elites in the West versus talking to elites outside of the West. I go outside the West into these BRICS countries and, I have an audience with all sorts of people, including people at the very top. In the West, that's not the case. And this just gets at the fact that I'm thinking, when I'm talking to you earlier in the conversation, in terms of the West versus the rest.
And I understand that BRICS obviously isn't a military association. That's not what it's there for. And they actually say themselves that they don't want to be like against Western institutions. They just want to build up parallel institutions, but naturally a sort of competition would arise from that, I would argue. Now, you already mentioned that Iran is a member of the BRICS countries now, which is interesting. It's probably one of the more contentious members, I would say. And that maybe leads us into the Israel-Gaza conflict. And what I find so interesting is that, or let me put it this way, let me maybe ask the question. You've said that Israel is interested in getting the US involved in a shooting war with Iran. And I wonder why that is.
Well, for a variety of reasons. First of all, the Israelis worry greatly about Iran's nuclear capability. Iran's very close to the point where it could develop enough fissile material for a bomb in probably about 2 or 3 weeks. It would take longer to produce an actual bomb, but they have a very sophisticated nuclear program, and the Israelis want to see it destroyed, and they cannot destroy it themselves, so they'd like us to destroy it.
And why can they not destroy it themselves? They have a very powerful, potent military force.
Not that powerful, not that potent. It's not clear we could do it. I've looked at the issue. It's not clear we could do it, but we might be able to do it. We might have enough bombers and missiles and bunker busters and so forth and so on that we could take it out. But I don't want to get distracted here, but it's very important to understand that it's a fool's errand, even if you can take it out. Because if you take it out, they'll just rebuild it, and they'll just dig deeper into the mountain and make it impossible for you to come back and attack it again. You want to remember, in 1949, the Soviets tested a bomb, okay? We had the bomb in 1945, talking about the Americans, 45. Soviets tested a bomb in 49. We gave a great deal of thought to going in and launching a preventive war against the Soviets' nuclear capability. Just taking it out, the way the Israelis would like to take out the Iranians' nuclear capability. We decided not to do it because we understood we could take it out for a short time, but they would eventually get nuclear weapons. They'd be mad as hornets, and if we ever got into a crisis, it would be a disaster. What I'm saying to you is we understood back then that we could not eliminate their nuclear arsenal forever. The same thing is true with Iran. It's important to understand that. But nevertheless, my first point to you in response to your question is that they want to drag us into a war. The Israelis want to drag us into a war with Iran. So number one, we take out their nuclear capability. The second reason is the Israelis have this dream, it's a delusion, that using military force, big stick diplomacy, they can remake the Middle East in ways that it is more user-friendly for Israel. And that means we have to get regime change in Iran. So if we use massive military force, the Americans and the Israelis together against Iran, that will cause the population to rise up, topple the regime, we'll get a liberal democracy, and we'll all live happily ever after. Those are two of the main reasons. But the third reason, which you don't want to lose sight of, is that the Israelis are deeply committed to ethnically cleansing Gaza and ethnically cleansing the West Bank. They want to drive the Palestinians out of Greater Israel, and that means mainly driving them out of Gaza, which they're trying to do now, and driving them out of the West Bank. And the best opportunity that the Israelis will have for driving the Palestinians out is to have a general conflagration in the Middle East. The bigger and wider the war, the better for ethnic cleansing.
Is that why they're attacking Lebanon? Is that why there's a conflict with Lebanon and Iran?
I don't think so. I could explain the conflict in Iran, but before I do that, I just want to say one thing about why a general conflagration is so such an opportunity for ethnic cleansing. You want to remember the Israelis have done two massive ethnic cleansing. One was in 1948 and the other was in 1967. And both of those cleansings took place in the context of major wars. The Israeli War of Independence in 1948 and the Six-Day War in 1967. And that's when the Israelis cleansed. And the idea is if you get a general conflagration, the United States and everybody else will be focusing on Iran versus the United States, and it'll be a situation where the Israelis can cleanse. So I think that's a very important reason for wanting to do this. But just to go to Lebanon, your question on Lebanon, the story in Lebanon is very interesting. October 7th happened. And the Israelis immediately began to retaliate, unsurprisingly. Hezbollah came to the defense of Hamas. It's very important to understand that the Israelis did not initiate the conflict against Hezbollah. Hezbollah initiated the conflict on October 8th, the day after October 7th. And they did so in support of Hamas. Okay? The problem for Israel is that there are now roughly 60, maybe 70,000 Israelis who have been displaced from northern Israel into central Israel, who want to go home but can't go home because Hezbollah is continuing to lob rockets and missiles into northern Israel. So the Israelis have had to try to figure out how they're going to prevent Hezbollah from firing missiles into northern Israel. Now, the easy way to do it is just shut down the war in Gaza. Just end the war in Gaza and Hezbollah will stop firing rockets and missiles. But the Israelis are bent on ethnic cleansing, and they're not going to shut down the war. They want to make Gaza unlivable. They want to drive the Palestinians out, and if they can't drive them out, they'll murder them all, right? Therefore, Hezbollah continues to fire rockets and missiles. So the Israelis said, let's end this with military force. First strategy they employed was decapitation. Remember, they killed Nasrallah. And they not only killed Nasrallah, they killed a handful of his lieutenants. Decapitation strategy, Hezbollah is headless, it can't continue the war. Decapitation does not work. The Israelis have been killing Palestinian leaders. They've been killing Hezbollah leaders for a long, long time. It does not work. Decapitation fails. Then they turn to a punishment strategy. That's killing large numbers of civilians. They start bombing southern Beirut. They start bombing villages and towns in southern Lebanon. That doesn't work. Then what do? Third strategy, they send the army, the IDF, ground forces into southern Lebanon. They had done that in 2006. It was a catastrophe for Israel in 2006. It's a catastrophe for Israel in 2024. They're now looking to get out of southern Lebanon. What does this tell you? They've not defeated Hezbollah. Hezbollah is still firing rockets and missiles into northern Israel. Right? So if you really think about the situation Israel is in, they've not defeated Hamas, they've not gotten the hostages back, they've not ethnically cleansed Gaza, they've not been able to defeat Hezbollah either through decapitation, punishment, or ground invasion. And now with regard to Iran, they whack Iran, Iran whacks them right back. The Israelis do not have escalation dominance vis-a-vis Iran. They do not have escalation dominance vis-a-vis Hezbollah. So they need the Americans more than ever. And that's why they're trying to get the Americans into a war. And by the way, this gets back to our larger conversation about the need for the United States to pivot to East Asia, right? We have to pivot to East Asia. What are we doing in Ukraine? What are we doing in the Middle East? We're sinking deeper and deeper into the mud in the Middle East. And the Israelis, of course, have a vested interest in getting us to sink deeper and deeper into the mud so we can help them with their foolish policies. And of course, we're doing that. But the end result is we can't pivot to Asia.
Mm-hmm. And it's really difficult when you can't concentrate resources. And I have this book on here, that you wrote, I think 2007? 2007. There's an Israel lobby in U.S. foreign policy, which explains why there's this unwavering support of the US in Israel, because a lot of people don't really understand why this has been going on for so long, and you describe it in this book. I just ordered it. I haven't read all of it yet, but I think a lot of people scratch their head and ask the question, why is this going on? There was actually an interesting article in the Times of Israel that quoted sources that Trump told Netanyahu he wants Gaza war over by the time he enters office. Do you believe that? Sources. That's who they quoted.
I wouldn't be surprised if Trump said that. But the question you have to ask yourself is, how seriously is Netanyahu going to take that statement?
But Trump is serious about the China threat. I mean, we do know this. I do think he understands that that is the peer competitor, right?
Absolutely.
Right? That's why he wants to shut down Ukraine. He, according to sources, wants this whole Gaza mess over, so he can concentrate resources on China. Yeah. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. I understand that.
Yeah. Very quick point here. You want to remember that up until 2017, the United States pursued a policy of engagement toward China. We traded with China to make it rich. We embedded China in international institutions that we ran, like the WTO. We were interested in promoting democracy in China. We had good relations with China. It was a policy of engagement, not containment. When Trump took office in 2017, he explicitly flushed engagement down the toilet bowl and adopted containment. So he is the president who switched our policy in fundamental ways on China, consistent with what you just said. And Biden, by the way, when Biden comes into the White House in 2021, Biden had been an arch proponent of engagement when he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and when he was vice president under Obama. He was Mr. Engagement. And containment, again, is contrary to engagement. So when Biden becomes president after Trump, one might expect him to go back to engagement. He does not. He doubles down on containment. He's even tougher. This is Biden on the Chinese than Trump was. And of course, if Trump comes in as president or Kamala Harris comes in as president, they will follow in the footsteps of both Trump and Biden. It's because China is a peer competitor. It's a potential regional hegemon. You could have Trump's views about Ukraine or my views about Ukraine because Russia's not that serious a threat. China is a completely different ballgame from America's point of view.
On the Israel-Gaza issue, I've been quite agnostic on the conflict because I feel like I just don't know enough about it. And I do look at, of course, what's happening, and I'm like, yeah, this doesn't seem, how do you say, verhältnismäßig? It doesn't seem like it's not a right use of force. I do understand that Israel has the right to defend itself. It just seems strange when I look at what's happening. And there have been protests in Germany, by students or, different groups that have been, shut down by police. And there's a lot of, strange things happening when people do voice their concern over the conflict in Gaza. I'm not saying some of the concerns that are voiced obviously are very harsh and probably not in alignment with establishment policy concerning Israel and Germany. But maybe those people who are a little bit more agnostic on the conflict, right, who don't know exactly what to think about it, and what would you tell them? What would you tell me in this case?
Well, I think that the proper view on this is to condemn Israel because Israel is committing genocide. For me, genocide is a red line. I'm actually shocked that Germany, of all countries, is complicit in this genocide. Of course, I'm shocked that the United States is complicit as well. both Germany and the United States, for moral reasons, and I even believe strategic reasons, certainly in the American case, we should be shutting this genocide down. We should have stopped it in its tracks. It should have never happened. And the Germans should have played a key role. They should have been shoulder to shoulder with us in stopping this genocide. This is just unacceptable to me from a moral point of view. And this is a case where the strategic logic and the moral logic line up. But that's not what has happened.
Can you explain to me, because I think a year ago, maybe not quite a year, you called it a massacre. And then you switched and you declared it a genocide. Maybe you can explain that.
Yeah. I think after October 7th, the Israelis saw an opportunity to cleanse Gaza. And what they thought was they could pummel Gaza mainly with bombs dropped from aircraft, but also from tanks that were used to level buildings. They could start to make Gaza look unlivable. They could start to move people out of northern Gaza into southern Gaza, which they were very successful at doing. And this would end up pushing all the Palestinians, or most of the Palestinians, out of Gaza. So they had a punishment campaign aimed at civilians that was designed to ethnically cleanse. The problem is they were not successful in pushing the Palestinians out. The Palestinians didn't leave. So they continued to pummel the Palestinians. They continued to bomb. They continued to drive more and more Palestinians out of their homes. They began to pursue a starvation strategy. And what happened was, because ethnic cleansing didn't work, it morphed into a genocide. It was just mass killing to start, but then it became a genocide. And this is why in December, South Africa went to the International Court of Justice. It was at the end of December that they filed their brief with the International Court of Justice. And I think it was in January when the International Court of Justice said that there was sufficient evidence to make a plausible case that Israel was committing genocide. So that's why I changed my view. I don't think it started out as a genocide. I don't think the Israelis were intent on murdering most of the Palestinians or a substantial portion of the Palestinians. I think they were interested in just ethnically cleansing. And in an ideal world, they would have been able to snap their fingers and the Palestinians would have been gone. Very important to understand, Jasmin, that inside Greater Israel is the Israel that was created in 1948, plus the West Bank, plus Gaza. Those three big chunks of territory comprise Greater Israel. Inside Greater Israel, there are roughly 7.3 million Jews and 7.3 million Palestinians, okay? And when you have a system like that, you can't have a true democracy, especially when you look at Palestinian birth rates versus Jewish birth rates inside Greater Israel, right? So you can't have a democracy. They don't want a two-state solution. They want to maintain Greater Israel. So how do you make it work? And the answer is you create an apartheid state. Israel is an apartheid state. It's, again, politically incorrect to say this in the West, but
in Germany as well.
Yeah, in Germany and in the United States and in Britain, right? Again, this is why the mainstream media avoids people like me and people like Jeff Sachs, because we say Israel is an apartheid state. But as I often point out to people, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights organization inside of Israel, those three human rights organizations, these are blue chip human rights organizations. All three of them have produced large reports, substantial reports, well documented, making the case that Israel is an apartheid state. And anybody who's ever been there, like me, knows it's an apartheid state. But the Israelis would like to put an end to that. They know what happened to South Africa. They don't want to remain an apartheid state. And the question is, how do you put an end to being an apartheid state when you don't want a two-state solution? You don't want to give the Palestinians a state, right? And you don't want to go to democracy, because if you go to democracy, it won't be a Jewish state. It'll be a Palestinian state in due course, right? The way you do it is you cleanse. ethnic cleansing is a way of dealing with the apartheid problem. That's what's going on here. They want as few Palestinians in their midst as possible. And again...
I mean, I will just say, when you say that, you just laid out that there's half of the population in Israel is Jewish, the other half is Palestinian. I understand the demographic development, but how can you call it an apartheid state when you have half of the population are Palestinians? And there's even Palestinians who have Israeli passports, who live there, who work there. Like, I don't quite understand.
There's some,
yeah.
The ones in current, but the vast majority don't. No, again, you should look at the 3 human rights groups' reports. This is a system of domination, right? Look at Gaza. I mean, why do you think October 7th happened? If you listen to Israelis and Israel's supporters in the United States, and many Germans, I'm sure, talk about what happened on October 7th, you would think that the Hamas fighters and the other fighters who attacked on October 7th were a bunch of Nazis, right? Like 1930s Nazis who all of a sudden decided they were just going to break into Israel and kill Jews because they hate Jews, right? These are like Nazis. This is ridiculous. This is not what was going on. Gaza was a giant open-air prison, or if you want, a giant concentration camp. Life inside Gaza was absolutely horrible. This is why people call Greater Israel an apartheid state. And basically what you had is a prison break on October 7th. These are resistance fighters. These are people who were unwilling to live anymore in a concentration camp or this giant open-air prison.
But the thing is with Gaza, okay, so I remember when the attacks happened on Israel and then the Israelis attacked Gaza, I hear about this open-air prison, and at the same time you see these pro-Palestinian protesters who post these videos from Gaza and the markets and how beautiful everything was. And I'm like, okay, so you're telling me it's an open-air prison, and at the same time it was such a beautiful beach and so great in Gaza, and Israel is destroying that. And I was like, how is that possible? Either it's shitty or it's not.
It was shitty.
Yeah, okay, but then why are they trying to, via videos and stuff, show us how great Gaza was before?
I don't know. I don't know.
See, this is like the videos that were like shown on Twitter to kind of show what Israel is destroying in Gaza, which I thought was a little bit contradictory to the story of Gaza being an open-air prison, to be honest. And then the second thing that I noticed, or I thought about, was, okay, so the whole Arabic, Muslim, Islamic world is sort of behind the Palestinians, behind Gaza, and supports them. Why are they not helping them? Why are they not taking in the Palestinian refugees? I don't understand it. I don't understand why they can't send humanitarian aid, and I'm sure they have in limited capacity, but why don't they take in the 2 million refugees into their own country?
Because they're Palestinians, and that's their land. They don't want to leave. As a German, you don't want to leave Germany and move into Poland.
Yeah, but I mean...
Or move into Czech.
No, well, but that's de facto what happened after the World War. You know, like the frontiers, I don't know, countries get new, how do you say, Grenzen?
Borders.
Borders, thank you. Countries have new borders, and then people get displaced. And I'm not saying this is a nice thing that happens, right? That's not what I'm saying. But how?
But you're saying it's acceptable.
No, I'm not saying it's acceptable. I'm just saying that the Palestinians are still considered refugees after being there for 70 years. Why are they still considered refugees? It's not like in Germany or after all the displacement happened after the Second World War.
Because this is their land. In fact, they want their land back. That's what Hamas is all about. If you go back to 1900, there are hardly any Jews in what is today
I understand
Greater
that.
Israel.
Okay, so, and this is why I'm probably so agnostic.
And the Zionists came in and they took the land.
But that's not exactly what happened, is it? I mean, there was like a declaration, there was something going on with the Brits, right? that gave the Israelis the land, or the Jews?
You think the British had the right to give the
No, that's not what I'm
land?
saying. But and this is why I'm so agnostic on this issue, because I am not very sure about certain historical facts, and I'm just like, this whole mess down there just seems to me like this black box of, I don't know, of unfortunate historic events, because I don't want the Jews all of a sudden to not have a country either. Is that understandable?
I fully understand why the Israelis want their own country, right? But you want to understand that this land, not too long ago, belonged to the Palestinians. But
these things happen all the time in history, John.
You can't make that. Of
but
course
they do. People get displaced, and I'm not saying it's fair, but don't. At some point, you kind of, just like with Ukraine, at some point they're going to have to accept what is. And it's the same in Israel. I'm sorry. I don't think it's that different.
They're not going to accept it. That's quite clear.
Exactly. But I'm saying but then you can have,
that's why the Israelis want to drive them out.
Yes, but you can choose unfair peace, or you can fight for fairness of the land. I mean, you could choose whichever you want. But sometimes unfair peace is probably better.
If you were a Palestinian living in Gaza and you were young, you would have joined Hamas in all likelihood.
I understand.
You would have rebelled.
Listen, John,
And if your family owned property that was now part of Israel, you would want that property back. You would view it as your property, right?
After decades and decades?
Yes, exactly.
Germany doesn't want territory back in Poland or in Czech.
Many Jews argue that Israel has a deed to the territory that it now controls.
Yes, a biblical deed, right?
Which is
it's a little ridiculous. I do understand that. I totally understand it, but I'm talking about the situation we have right now. So what are we going to do with what we have right now? And sometimes things are unfair, John. It's just how it goes. Do we want this fighting to continue forever? Because this is what I'm thinking.
I want to be very clear here. The United States believed for a long time that it had a solution, and many American leaders still believe there is a solution. It's the two-state solution. In other words, divide the land, divide Greater Israel, give the Palestinians a viable state of their own. This is
not a viable solution. You've said so yourself. This is not going to happen.
That's right. But why is it not a viable solution?
Well, probably because Israelis don't want to give them their land.
That's
right?
correct.
Yeah,
that's right.
I recognize that.
Well, if they don't give them their land, you can then expect the Palestinians to fight back.
Okay, I understand this, and I totally understand. I understand that when you're a young person in Gaza and you've seen your family be killed by an IDF attack or what, I understand it completely. I just wonder for how long do we want to continue this conflict?
Whose way?
Well, I mean, it's not only. Well,
It's for how long do the Palestinians want to continue to resist, and for how long do the Israelis want to continue?
Well, it's not just between Israel and the Palestinians, is it? There's obviously a global community that is involved.
The global community is largely ineffectual because of the United States. You pointed out that Steve Walt and I wrote this book. The United States basically supports Israel.
But that's why I'm saying there's other countries involved. It's not just Israel and the resistance in Gaza.
Yeah, but the country that's involved that matters is the United States, and it's joined at the hip with Israel. It does basically what Israel wants. We wanted a two-state solution. It's just very important to understand that. Every president from Jimmy Carter forward was deeply committed to creating a two-state solution. We could not get a two-state solution because Israel had little interest, and the lobby went to great lengths to undermine the pressure that any American president put on Israel to move to a two-state solution. You ended up with an apartheid state. And when you have an apartheid state where you have, roughly an equal number of Palestinians and Israeli Jews living inside it, the dominated group is going to revolt. First Intifada, Second Intifada, October 7th. This is hardly surprising at all. And the question on the table is, can you beat the Palestinians into submission. When I listen to you talk, I think of Zev Jabotinsky, you know, and his concept of the Iron Wall in the 1920s and 30s. Jabotinsky believed that Israel could use the big stick to beat the Palestinians into submission.
That's not what I was saying, John.
Yes, no, you were saying after all these decades, all these years of fighting and not...
I just want the fighting to stop. I don't want anybody to beat anybody with a stick.
I agree, but how are you going to get this fighting to stop?
I understand that that's not there's not an easy solution to that. It just seems like there's no point to it. It's just like this spiral that we're in, and it's just continuing.
Yeah, I do understand what you're saying.
I just don't want to be compared to probably a Zionist who wants to beat the Palestinians with a stick.
But no, I wasn't, that was not my point. My point was that Jabotinsky believed that the Palestinians, after so many years of all of this horribleness, would come to the realization that it just has to stop and we would get peace. And that's, I think, where you were going. This just needs to end, right? The Israelis have been clobbering the Palestinians for so long. It's clear the Israelis are not going to cut the Palestinians any slack. Therefore, it's time for the Palestinians to recognize reality and put an end to this. That was Jabotinsky's view. That was the Iron Wall. You could beat the Palestinians into submission. What I'm telling you is that's not the way the world works. And what is happening here, if anything, is you are radicalizing the Palestinians, you are radicalizing the Arab world, and making it more difficult to get a two-state solution. In fact, I would argue it's impossible. And just to take this one step further, it's not just Hezbollah who has been supporting Hamas. There's one other group that has actually come to the aid of Hamas, and that's the Houthis. And the Houthis are not much of a fighting force vis-a-vis Israel at this point in time, but over time, they're going to get rockets, they're going to get missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, they're going to get drones, and they're going to be a major thorn in the side of the Israelis. So the Israelis have this situation where they have Hezbollah, Iran, the Palestinians, to include Hamas, the Houthis. They have rockets and missiles, which Israel can only deal with to a limited extent. This is a terrible situation in terms of an external threat environment. And then when you look at the internal threat environment, you've got this huge number of Palestinians in your midst. And furthermore, you have all these centrifugal forces inside the Jewish community in Israel. You want to remember, before October 7th, I read the Israeli newspapers every day, the ones that are in English anyway. But before October 7th, they were talking about a civil war in Israel over judicial reforms, reforming the Supreme Court. It was a bitter fight. And there are other centrifugal forces at play inside the country as well. So this is a country that's in real trouble. And again, American presidents wanted to help solve this problem a long time ago by moving to a two-state solution. But the Israelis thought that they could beat the Palestinians into submission or keep them under control. And they were wrong.
This has been an interesting discussion. I think that I'll probably keep my I won't keep my agnostic view on Israel and Gaza, because I do understand that what's happening is unfair. It's not just, right? Like, you can't just go about killing tens of thousands.
The genocide is more than unfair.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, genocide is a red line, and as soon as I see,
I think I have trouble using that word, to be honest. Like, and maybe it's because I'm in Germany and I'm afraid to say something like that,
you would get in trouble in Germany.
I guess I am a little bit afraid.
Germany has basically abandoned free speech on this issue. In fact, I bet
on a lot of issues, but yeah, especially concerning Israel and all of that stuff, I just get really like, I kind of freeze up, and I'm like, I don't even know what can I compare, because you've used the word concentration camp, you've used the word genocide, and I'm like, I get a little...
And apartheid.
yeah, and you use these words, and I'm like, I am a little afraid to even use these words because, you know, you can get in trouble comparing things and
I think that's correct. I
yeah.
think there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But that's the power of the lobby, right? See, the lobby goes to great lengths to control the discourse.
And everything is anti-Semitic. Like you can, like even using words like globalist can be, you know, interpreted as like anti-Semitic. And I'm like, okay, I mean, it's just very stressful, I guess I would say.
Yeah, there's no question. If you criticize Israel, even if you're Jewish, right, you'll be called either a self-hating Jew or an anti-Semite. I remember when Steve and I wrote the book, a number of people said to us, the real problem with you guys is that you're not Jewish. And if you were Jewish, you could get away with this. And we told people at the time, and I would say it again now, that's not true. They don't care whether you're Jewish or not. Just look at Norman Finkelstein. They've gone to enormous lengths to destroy Norman's career and destroy Norman's life. And Norman is the child of Holocaust survivors, right? Both his parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they were then evacuated to Majdanek, and his father was in Auschwitz. I mean, Norman is, legitimately Jewish, and nevertheless, they've decided that they're going to destroy him. That's the way it works. It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or not. You just can't criticize Israel. And the reason that the lobby and Israel itself, of course, don't want an open discourse is because if you have an open discourse, if you turn people like me, Jeff Sachs, Norman Finkelstein, assorted other people loose, and we can talk to large audiences about what's going on in the Middle East and what's going on inside Israel, I believe lots of people will accept much of what we say. And this, they believe, would be disastrous for Israel. And I want to make it very clear that I think that being unable to criticize Israel and supporting Israel unconditionally, which is what Germany is doing, is not in Israel's interests. I think Germany is pursuing a policy towards Israel today that is damaging to Israel because it is facilitating a genocide. Israel is in a hole and it's digging deeper and deeper. And countries like Germany, countries like Britain, and countries like the United States are down in that hole with Israel with their shovels, helping the Israelis dig deeper and deeper. Israel needs some tough love. It needs the United States and countries like Germany to tell it to change its behavior, to certainly stop the genocide.
One personal question at the end of our conversation. So, like I said in the introduction, Foreign Affairs magazine has recognized you as one of the most famous political science professors in history. And I just wanted to know what's that like?
Well, when I was young, I was not a good student. I never imagined that I would be a professor at the University of Chicago. I never imagined I would be a professor. And I never imagined that I would be a well-known or famous professor. But it has happened. And I think that I find it all very surprising. And sometimes I have to pinch myself to make sure it is really happening. When I'm at a place like Oxford or Cambridge, or even when I'm in China, huge numbers of students want to talk to me. They want to take selfies. They want me to sign their books. And it's, very flattering, very humbling. But it is, in a very important way, hard to believe. I sometimes refer to myself as a Marxist, as in Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx once famously said that he would never want to belong to a club that would have him as a member. And I, in that way, consider myself to be a rather humble individual, and therefore find this all quite surprising. But to be honest, I'm glad that I have the influence that I have, because I get to make arguments that I think are important arguments for people to hear. I don't want to say that I'm right, you're wrong. That's not the way I think my business works. I have a particular set of views on important subjects. I've spent a lot of years studying these issues, and I think that it's important for people to hear me out, as many people as possible. And I think students, by the way, when I go around and talk on campuses, appreciate this. It's not like I'm a preacher who's coming in and trying to convert everybody, or I'm coming in and delivering the truth. What I'm doing is coming in and telling people what I think, and I'm trying to lay out a reasoned argument based on lots of evidence. And I like it when people disagree with me. When you push back at me, that's fine. I love that. I love the back and forth. I think it's how we all learn. And the fact that, I seem to be playing an important role in making that happen these days with regard to foreign policy issues, I think is a wonderful thing. But again, I'm shocked that I am where I am.
Thank you so much, John, for so much of your time. I do want to tell the people out there that are like, oh man, I wish I could debate John. There is an AI out there. You can debate. I actually spoke with your AI and it was actually really interesting because I'm like, no, I don't believe that. And he's like, well, I understand. It has your sound, very much so. So it actually works quite well. I will link it at the bottom so people can maybe start discussing and debating your views. As you are very open to debate. We see it all the time. You get invited to panels. You love discussing and debating things with people. So I think that's what a lot of people appreciate about you and students as well. And they do it. I think they appreciate because you've been very consistent over the years.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people appreciate.
Well, the person who built the AI bot, it was not my idea. It was David Sachs, who's an entrepreneur. It was his idea. And he said to me, John, he said, you're the ideal person to develop an AI bot for, because you are so consistent. It's what you were just saying. That he said, you've written so much and you've given so many talks, done so many videos, that we can program all of that, into the system. And it's not like you're going to say A one day and B the next day. You say A all the time.
Absolutely. And it's a little frustrating too, because I'm like, I think my argument was really good right now. Why didn't you but it's very, you argue in a very kind manner, I would say. I did ask the AI one question that was actually interesting. I asked what you would like to talk about but never have been asked. And you know what the AI responded?
I have no idea.
It said, a topic that intrigues me is the long-term impact of artificial intelligence on global power structures and how it might alter traditional power dynamics among states. Is that something you would actually?
Yes, yeah, that is a good answer.
Is that something you would like to talk about? How AI could influence global power structures?
I wouldn't want to talk about it because I don't know anything. And one thing I've learned, if you're a public figure and you go around talking about important issues, if somebody asks you a question and you really don't know much about it, you should say very nicely, I really don't know much about that question, and I'm reluctant to talk about it because I wouldn't have anything intelligent to say. And that's true of AI, which is not to deny that it's a very important subject.
Mm-hmm. And well, maybe that's something you can read up on or discuss with your AI. And I will take that piece of advice because I have been in a position where I was like, ugh, this is not something I can actually talk about. And I did talk about it. And it wasn't a very contentious issue, so it wasn't a big deal. But that definitely was a good reminder to me that it's better when you're a public figure to sometimes just say, I don't know.
Exactly.
It's okay to not know everything, right? Yeah.
When I was young, I would try and BS my way through a question. I didn't know what I was talking about. But with the passage of time, I learned that's not the way to operate.
Okay, so I guess I still have, it's okay to maybe make that mistakes a few times when you're still learning about being a public figure. You have a few years ahead of, just a few, right? Yeah. You say you're 28 at heart, right? Yes. You're forever 28. Well, I'm sure we're going to continue to see a lot from you. You're probably going to be jetting around the world talking to presidents, and not in the West, but in the rest of the world. And I'll definitely link the AI down at the bottom and your Substack, I think, because that's a great way to really keep up with what you're doing, right? Yeah,
I try to put everything I do on the Substack.
Yeah, it's a very good, everything is concentrated on your Substack. Yeah. So thank you so much for the time that you gave me, John. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. It was my pleasure.